Lasting from July 1957 to December 1958, the International Geophysical Year was a massive, intensive, multinational, multidisciplinary, global research effort whose 67 participating nations engaged in study of 11 different Earth sciences via simultaneous worldwide observation. While the IGY included research across the globe, under the oceans, and in outer space, it made a particular effort to study Antarctica, the least explored area on Earth. The 11 nations that participated in the Antarctic portion of the IGY established several permanent bases on our southern continent, including the first permanent station at the South Pole. The effort to create a permanent research presence at literally the end of the Earth required enormous effort of scientists and militaries, supported uniquely by two teenagers in New Jersey. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
The IGY was inspired by International Polar Years, collaborative efforts to study the Earth's polar regions that occurred in 1882-83 and 1932-33, but with a broader scope that took into account developments in things like rockets and radar. The IGY included many significant discoveries and achievements, including the launching of the Earth's first artificial satellites. The U.S. contribution to research in Antarctica included scientific teams funded by the National Science Foundation, but the U.S. Navy was called upon to provide the necessary support for these teams. Called Operation Deep Freeze, the expedition between 1955 and 1956 was placed under the command of renowned polar explorer Rear Admiral Richard Byrd. The expedition was assigned a task force of 10 vessels, including the icebreaker USS Glacier, the subject of another episode of The History Guy, under the command of Rear Admiral George J. Dufek, as well as more than a dozen aircraft and numerous pieces of heavy equipment. A mobile construction battalion of Navy Seabees who were given the extraordinary task of creating 7 permanent research stations. Dufek's task force was responsible for supplying and resupplying these bases, as well as transporting the scientists to and from Antarctica. In 2007, Elaine Hood wrote in the Antarctic Sun, the newspaper of the United States Antarctic Program. Over the course of the next 2 years, these men braved primitive conditions to do what no one had ever done before: build functioning facilities with electricity, running water, and science labs in locales where the explorers before them had struggled to survive. The name Seabees, S-C-A-B-E-E-S, is actually a heterograph, a different spelling of the acronym CB, meaning Construction Battalion. The concept of construction battalions developed during war plans in the 1930s, and they were officially formed in 1942. CB saw distinguished service in the Second World War, fulfilling vital functions, often in the forefront of combat operations. But CB roles included working in polar regions almost from the start. And one of the roles of the Seabees during the war was oil exploration in the Arctic Circle.
Thus, it was well within their experience when 188 Seabees were called to duty in 1946 for Operation High Jump. The purpose of Operation High Jump was to establish an Antarctic research station on the Ross Ice Shelf. Called Little America 4, it would be located near the site of 3 other bases from previous U.S. Antarctic expeditions, and would be the location of yet another base for Operation Deep Freeze.
Operation Deep Freeze 1, there would be many more to follow, intended to establish 2 bases, one at the Bay of Whales, near the previous Little America bases, and an airstrip at McMurdo Sound, in preparation for the creation of 2 additional new bases in the interior the following year. Changing conditions on the ice shelf required that Little America 5 be situated approximately 20 miles from the previous Little America bases. The vessels of the task force transported an estimated 20,000 tons of materials and supplies, while 2 fleet oilers carried 540,000 gallons of aviation fuel to support the air operations. Aircraft would map more than 1 million square miles of previously unexplored territory in the Antarctic summer.
In addition, the task force carried around 2,500 pounds of mail from eager philatelists who wanted to receive a postmark from Antarctica.
Some 1,800 personnel were involved in the construction of the bases, using largely prefabricated huts. Little America consisted of 19 buildings connected by tunnels. They also had to identify suitable locations to create the landing strips for aircraft and engaged in exploration. After constructing facilities, the ships of the task force returned to the United States to prepare for the expedition the following year, while 73 men were left behind to winter at Little America and 93 at McMurdo Sound. To sustain them and prepare for construction the following year, 15,000 tons of supplies and materials were left behind.
Of course, the Antarctic winter was rather harsh. 154 inches of snow were recorded between February and October at Little America. The lowest mean temperature, minus 78 degrees Fahrenheit, occurred on August 9th, but sustained winds meant that it was often the equivalent of minus 90 degrees. A 1957 report noted that when workers at McMurdo Station cleared an ice airstrip for the preparation of the return of air service in October, a late blizzard came and buried the new strip under 8 feet of snow.
Deep Freeze 2, covering the Antarctic summer between 1956 and 1957, was even more busy. The task force brought an additional 30,000 tons of supplies and building materials. The first plane arrived at McMurdo October 16th, and with it, the first mail the men there had seen since February. Deep Freeze 2 would include the first ever aircraft landing at the geographical South Pole, bringing with it the first ever Americans to set foot on the South Pole. There to build what would become Amundsen Scott Station, the first ever permanent research facility at the South Pole. 16 men, 8 scientists, and 8 Navy support would spend the 1957 Antarctic winter there. In all, Operations Deep Freeze 1 and 2 would establish 7 research stations on the continent to support the International Geophysical Year, which would lead to the establishment of the United States Antarctic Research Program in 1959, today called the United States Antarctic Program, and a permanent U.S. scientific presence on the Antarctic continent, including at the South Pole. The accomplishments of Operation Deep Freeze over the 2 years, 1955 to 1957, in preparation for the IGY were significant. In fact, extraordinary given the conditions. But among the many challenges was that of the morale for troops living not just in extreme environments, but separated from their families, sometimes for more than a year at a time. That was much more difficult in 1955 because in the era before global communication satellites, there was no easy way for even the Navy to make a phone call from Antarctica. And the Seabees and scientists' means of communicating with their families came from a surprising source: amateur radio enthusiasts. The etymology of the term ham radio might surprise you. According to G.M. Dodge, the president of Dodge's Telegraph, Railroad Accounting, and Railway Institute, in his 1901 book, The Telegraph Instructor, the word ham was used synonymously with the word plug to refer to a telegraph operator who lacks ability. That is, someone who is bad at Morse code would be described as ham-fingered. Ham at the time had a general pejorative connotation, meaning roughly tactless or clumsy, as with a ham actor or a ham-handed apology. According to the American Radio Relay League, some early amateur radio stations were powerful enough to interfere with commercial stations, and commercial operators started to refer to these pesky amateurs as hams, who were sometimes accused of hamming police radio frequencies. Rather than be offended, the amateur radio community then apparently embraced the term, and still today refer to themselves as hams. The strange etymology has resulted in a now debunked myth, asserting that the name came from an early station at Harvard University, whose operators, Albert Hyman, Bob Almy, and Poogie Murray, chose ham as their call signs based on the first letters of their surnames. And the term commonly used in parts of the ham world, hobby amateur, is actually an example of a backronym, an acronym created from an existing term. Ham radio generally operates at high frequencies in bands designated by the Federal Communications Commission. Those frequencies can sometimes reflect off the Earth's ionosphere, essentially bouncing around the globe. While vulnerable to disruption by things like solar flares, ham radio was often the only option available for the men of Operation Deep Freeze to talk to someone back at home. The Arctic Sun explains. Ham radio was the only means of talking to loved ones back home in the era preceding satellite-enabled telephony. For the men who arrived at what is now McMurdo Station in December 1955 and who did not depart until a year or two later, hearing a wife's voice or son's laughter was an important morale booster. But communication from Antarctica via ham radio was not easy. Historian Diane Olson Bellinger wrote in her 2010 book Deep Freeze, The United States, the International Geophysical Year, and the Origins of Antarctica's Age of Science, voice-to-voice communication with someone special required timing, luck, and favorable ionospheric conditions, ever problematic during the period of great solar unrest. It required people at both ends to find the right frequency to make a connection at both ends and stand by, that is, listen in, to switch the equipment from transmit mode to receive when one speaker finished and said, over. In particular, the system rested on dedicated, though unofficial radio operators at the IGY stations and scores of amateur hams across the United States who received and forwarded hamgrams, short personal telegram-like messages and linked callers with phone patches. Numerous hams dedicated time and effort to keeping the men of Deep Freeze in contact with their loved ones, including local amateur radio chapters and, Bellinger writes, famous hams Arthur Godfrey, Art Linkletter, and Barry Goldwater. But one particular ham stood out, Bellinger told the Arctic Sun. When Deep Freeze personnel were asked to name people deserving recognition, the overwhelming majority began their list with ham radio operators. Jules Mady's name appeared on everyone's lists. The Bridgewater, New Jersey Courier News wrote in 1959, young Mady seems to have been born with an affinity for radio. When he was a child, Jules took coils of wire to bed with him. When he was 7, he began making tiny crystal radio sets on toy rings he found in breakfast cereal boxes. The Antarctic Sun goes on. The Clark, New Jersey teen and his 13-year-old brother John were radio control airplane enthusiasts when they learned a person could increase flying capabilities by operating on the ham radio frequencies. Studying together to learn the Morse code, they both got their ham licenses in 1954 and soon realized that talking to people around the world via ham radio was as much fun as flying airplanes. The Courier News writes that the same year, Jules won first prize for ninth graders in the Greater Newark Science Fair with a 70,000-volt high-frequency generator. A 2014 edition of Princeton, New Jersey's Town Topic suggests their interest was partially sparked by a 1955 visit to an exhibition of vacuum tubes collected by photographer Howard E. Schrader at Princeton University's Firestone Library, which the paper described as perhaps the world's largest collection of vacuum tubes. Town Topics continues. Mr. Schrader went on to introduce the brothers to leading Princeton scientists, such as world-renowned theoretical physicist John Archibald Wheeler. In turn, Professor Wheeler arranged for them to have access to the department's collection of surplus electronic chassis in the attic of the old Palmer Laboratories of Physics. The Mady brothers' contribution to Operation Deep Freeze was exceptional for several reasons. For one, with the support of their parents, the Mady brothers had installed a massive 110-foot antenna, making for better reception than most hams. Second, Jules had connected his radio to a telephone, allowing patches, as well as a radio fax machine that allowed transmission of scientific data and photos, albeit slowly. Navy radio operator Tom Montgomery told the Arctic Sun, he had a huge antenna, so his reception was good, and he had a telephone hooked up for patching calls. Sometimes when I would be transmitting, I'd be picked up by someone in, say, California, but they didn't have the capability of placing a phone patch. Jules did. It was just easier working with Jules than anyone else. I talked to him almost every night for over a year. But perhaps most of all was the brothers' dedication, the Courier News wrote in 1959. Since Operation Deep Freeze began, Jules has spent as much as 10 and 12 hours a day at his radio equipment, connecting telephone calls from persons in the United States to their friends and relatives at the South Pole. Journalist Ed Katerba, who made a visit to Antarctica to report on Deep Freeze, wrote in 1959, daily in McMurdo, the public address system would resound with, "Now hear this, now hear this. The ham shack is into Clark, New Jersey."
The Monongahela, Pennsylvania Daily Republican said of him, "He gets not a penny for his service. He just figures this is one way of doing his good deed for the day."
The Madys had an enormous impact on the men of Operation Deep Freeze. Katerba wrote that the loneliness of an Antarctic existence can only be felt when you are there to feel it yourself. In 7 months, Jules kept a 14,000-mile pipeline between his station and McMurdo Sounds. In the past year, Jules processed 4,800 messages between men and their families. Vic Young, a radio man in the ham shack at Little America 5 in 1956, told the Arctic Sun, the men would come into the ham shack to talk to their wives. They'd be a bit down because here it was cold and dark. And they'd come into the shack and I'd put them through to Jules. I'd watch the person change from morose to his morale going way up as soon as he heard Jules' voice, putting through the phone patch. Ken Waldron, one of the 18 men who spent the first winter at the South Pole in 1957, said of him, "You know, the thing I remember best is that Jules would get the Sunday paper and read the comics and the sport pages to us over the radio. He was precocious enough to realize how important it was for us. Can you imagine being 16 years old and understanding the psychological impact of hearing the news like that?"
The men of Operations Deep Freeze 1 and 2 managed what can only be described as engineering miracles in the 2 years leading up to the International Geophysical Year. 8 of them lost their lives in the effort. They made possible the robust international research that continues today on the world's most remote continent. Volunteers like Jules and John Mady made that work bearable, and many men who participated in Operation Deep Freeze later made trips to New Jersey to meet the boys in person. John Mady attended the California Institute of Technology, became a world-renowned and award-winning physicist, most famous for his invention of the free electron laser. He held 13 patents. Passed away in 2014, the age of 73. For his service, Jules Mady was given the Edison Radio Amateur Award for Public Service in 1959. He was treated to a tour of Europe as a guest of the French government in recognition of efforts he made to allow French scientists to keep in contact with Antarctic expeditions, and in 1959 was given an all-expense-paid visit to Antarctica by the United States Navy. He also attended Caltech, eventually worked for the New York State Thruway Authority, where he invented the Easy Pass electronic toll collection system. There's a mountain in Antarctica, Mady Ridge, named in his honor. He lives in Hillsdale, New York. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.